Hello friends. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. I've spent 2 years telling myself that what happened in the Chihuahuan Desert was something I survived by luck. But every time I shut my eyes, I remember the moment I realized it wasn't luck at all. It was timing. It was silence. And maybe it was the desert choosing not to swallow me. I wasn't supposed to be out there alone. At least that's what everyone back home in Ohio had said when I announced I was taking a solo camping trip across New Mexico before starting my new job in Santa Fe. My old coworker joked, "People disappear out there, man. Whole landscapes bigger than states. Not smart." I'd laughed it off. I wanted space, not company. I wanted heat, dry air, sunlight so sharp it felt like it could cut through worry. I didn't want to think about the breakup that wrecked my summer, or the job I'd left behind, or the way the city had started to feel like a cage with no door. The desert felt like freedom. Back then, I didn't understand that the desert also holds secrets better than any graveyard ever could. I had covered nearly 14 miles that day. Harsh, uneven miles through the western edge of the Chihuahuan Desert, near the Guadalupe foothills. By the time the sun began sinking, my legs felt like they'd been carved from stone and left out in the sun too long. The landscape stretched endlessly around me. Low, sprawling creosote bushes, thorny yuccas, ocotillo branches like skeletal arms reaching toward the sky. Rust-colored ridges rose on the horizon like ancient monuments. Everything around me felt old. Older than memory, older than the country, older than the idea of people. Most of my college friends had settled into the usual routine: marriages, mortgages, playdates. Meanwhile, I was wandering through a landscape that could swallow a person whole and never mention it to anyone. And somehow, that felt right. I had stayed off the official trails all day, wanting silence, wanting isolation so complete it felt like a reset button. By evening, I needed to find shelter. That's when I spotted a natural alcove, rugged sandstone formations stacked like giant broken teeth, creating a partial pocket shielded from the wind. Private. Hidden. Perfect. I could have walked right past it if the light hadn't hit the stone at the right angle. I pitched my small 2-person tent behind the largest rock, angling it so the opening faced inward toward stone rather than outward to the desert. Something about the isolation felt good. Something about the privacy felt necessary. I ate cold trail mix and jerky while the sky shifted through its usual desert magic. Orange, gold, violet, then a deep river black scattered with stars. No signal. Expected. I'd downloaded offline maps. I'd told my brother I'd check in after 3 days when I reached a town. Everything was fine. Everything was peaceful. By 9:30, I crawled into my sleeping bag. The air cooled fast once the sun vanished. The nylon walls rustled softly. The stillness pressed in like a warm blanket. Sleep came fast. Too fast. Because when I woke up again, the world was no longer peaceful. The sound ripped me awake like something physical. Engines, loud and angry, ripping across the desert floor. ATVs. 3? 4? More? It was impossible to tell. They revved and sputtered in sharp, irregular bursts that echoed off the rocks. For the first 3 seconds, I thought, night riders. Locals having fun. No big deal. Then the engines cut off all at once. That silence, that sudden, unnatural silence, told me everything. These weren't joyriders. I stayed completely still, my breath trapped somewhere between my chest and throat. My eyes adjusted slowly to the black inside my tent, When I finally forced myself to move, I unzipped my sleeping bag silently, inch by agonizing inch. I crawled toward the small mesh window built into the tent wall. The desert outside was dim, lit only by a faint sliver of moon and starlight. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then I saw lights, not headlights. Flashlights. 4 or 5 beams sweeping across the desert floor about 300 yards east, moving with intention. Not scattered, not confused, coordinated. My heartbeat hammered against the tent floor. My mouth dried instantly. The silhouettes appeared next. Men, 4 or 5 of them. One carried something long across his shoulders. Rifle? Shotgun? Hard to tell from that distance. They reached a shallow basin, just a dip in the earth, and gathered in a circle. Metal hit dirt, rhythmic, steady. Shovels. They were digging. Fast. My entire body went cold as understanding slid into place like a knife. Whatever they were doing, it wasn't legal. It wasn't innocent. And I was close enough to hear the metal striking the ground. I pressed myself into the tent floor, hardly daring to blink. 20 agonizing minutes passed. Then 2 men left toward where the ATVS had stopped behind a ridge. When they came back, they dragged something between them. Something wrapped in a heavy blue tarp. A shape too familiar. A shape I'd seen in ER rooms when I worked fast response shifts. A shape that only meant one thing. A body. They dumped it into the pit. Carelessly. I felt bile rise into my throat, but swallowed it back, refusing to make a sound. The men shoveled dirt back over the tarp. One poured something from a jug onto the soil. Masking scent? Weighing soil down? No idea. All I knew was that the flashlight beam swung wider now, searching arcs. Each time a beam came near my alcove, I buried my face and held my breath until my lungs burned. I thought about every true crime case I'd ever heard. Wrong place, wrong time. Witness sees too much. Witness disappears. This desert could swallow me too. When the men finished, they smoked for a few minutes. Orange cigarette tips floating in darkness like demon eyes. Then engines roared to life again. My heart pounded so violently I felt dizzy. Headlights swept across the desert floor, bright arcs cutting through the darkness. If those beams touched my tent, I was done. They swept close. Close enough that my shadow lit the back of the tent wall for a second. But then the ATVs veered away. Slowly. Then faster. Then fading. Then gone. Silence returned. But it wasn't peace. It was the kind of silence you feel in your teeth. It was the kind that tells you danger hasn't ended. It's only watching. I stayed frozen for at least an hour. When I finally forced myself to move, I began packing silently. No headlamp. Darkness was safer. I shoved gear into my pack with shaking hands. I slipped out of the tent just enough to breathe fresh air. And that's when I saw it. My lungs locked. A tire track. Fresh. Deep. No more than 6 inches from my tent. The tread curved around the rock formation like a careful arc. They came here. One of them drove right up to my tent. Close enough to rip it open. Close enough to hear me breathe. They had seen me. No doubt. But they hadn't confronted me. They had just left. Why? The question tore through my mind. Were they coming back? Were they watching from somewhere unseen? Every shadow looked alive. Every whisper felt like breath on my neck. I didn't think. I ran. North, away from them, away from the basin, away from everything. I moved silently through the darkness, guided only by the faint outline of distant ridges. I tripped repeatedly, fell, tore the skin off my palms, didn't stop, no headlamp, couldn't risk it. Every few minutes I froze, listening. No engines, no voices, only the desert, breathing its ancient, lonely breath. Hours passed. The night thinned. Dawn stained the eastern horizon purple, then blue, then orange. My legs felt like fire. My throat was raw from dry air. My pack felt heavier with every step. But when I crested a ridge and saw a thin gray asphalt strip cutting the valley, I almost collapsed. A highway. A way out. A way to survive. A trucker picked me up around 7 a.m. An older guy named Wallace, hauling farm equipment toward Las Cruces. He took one look at me, dust-covered, shaking, scraped bloody, and didn't ask a single unnecessary question. He handed me a bottle of water. Let me use his phone. I called 911 with hands that shook so badly I nearly dropped the phone. The dispatcher transferred me to the county sheriff. We arranged to meet at a gas station 30 miles south. I told the deputy everything, every detail, from the ATVs to the tarped body to the tire track by my tent. He didn't react until the end, just nodded and asked if I could guide them back. I didn't want to. I didn't want to see that place again. But I said yes. Someone deserved to be found. It took hours to navigate back through rough terrain with 2 deputies and a cadaver dog. The afternoon sun turned the desert into a furnace. 20 minutes into the search, the dog alerted at a patch of disturbed earth, exactly where I said it would be. They dug slowly, carefully. When the first corner of blue tarp appeared, the deputy looked at me with something between horror and respect. Inside was a woman around her early 40s, unidentified, dead less than 48 hours. The case opened, stayed open, never solved. They never found the men, never learned why they buried her there, never learned where they came from, or where they went, or why they didn't kill me when they had the chance. I've asked that question every day since. Sometimes I tell myself they simply didn't see me. Other times, I know they did. And leaving me alive was a choice, not mercy, not fear, a calculation, a witness with no proof, a story too wild to believe, a hiker who would sound half mad describing what she saw. I left New Mexico, moved east, took a job in a quieter state where the trees hide the sky and the horizon is never too far. I don't camp alone anymore, not even in my own backyard. The desert took something I can't get back, the feeling that being alone in nature is safe. But it gave me something too, the knowledge that fear is useful when you listen to it. And sometimes silence is the only thing standing between you and a grave you were never supposed to see. After my divorce finalized in March 2016, I decided to do something that most of my friends thought was either foolish or reckless. I quit my office job at a small finance firm in Charleston, sold most of my possessions, and decided to hike a remote stretch of the Appalachian Trail alone. At 36, no kids, no mortgage, and a modest savings cushion, I felt like the world was mine to wander. I had done weekend camping trips before, but nothing as long or as remote as this. This was solo, deep wilderness, and I craved it. Not for escape, exactly, but for clarity. By the 6th day on the trail, I reached a ridge my topo map labeled Craven Ridge, nestled somewhere in Western Virginia. It was ideal. A flat clearing with enough room for my 2-person tent, perched just 30 feet from a steep drop that plunged into a forested valley below. The woods stretched endlessly, green and shadowed, unbroken for miles. No hikers had passed me in 2 days, which was perfect. My phone had died days ago, as expected, and I'd grown comfortable with silence and disconnection. That Wednesday evening, I set up camp, started a small fire, and heated a packet of freeze-dried chili. It tasted like cardboard soaked in regret, but the warmth was comforting. The sun dipped behind the mountains around 7:45, staining the sky orange and violet. I lingered for a moment, letting the color wash over me, the valley below fading into shadow. For the first time in months, I felt genuinely calm. The tension of the past year, the divorce, the long nights filled with loneliness, seemed distant, even irrelevant. But that calm would not last. Around 10:30 p.m., I was drifting toward sleep when a sharp crack echoed up from the valley below. Stone hitting stone. My first thought was natural. Rocks tumbled. Maybe an animal dislodged something. But then another struck. And another. There was rhythm here. A rock every 8 to 10 seconds. Deliberate, almost musical. I unzipped my tent quietly, stepping into the cool night air, breath misting in the moonlight. The fire had burned down to faint embers, offering only a dim glow. I crept to the edge of the clearing, scanning the valley. Darkness swallowed everything, dense and absolute. Yet the rocks kept falling. 14, 15, 16. A slow, steady drumbeat of impact. The sound seemed to come from a ledge to my left, about a quarter mile away. But there was no movement, no light, nothing suggesting human presence. My mind raced through possibilities. Animals, natural rock slides, or something else. Experience told me this was intentional. Someone, or something, was sending a message. After 20 minutes, the rhythm stopped. Silence replaced the noise, heavier than the clatter had been. I slipped back into my tent, zipped it tight, and lay awake, listening to the heartbeat of the forest. Every nerve in my body was alert. Somewhere past midnight, I dozed briefly, only to awaken to a silence that felt wrong. The forest itself seemed to be holding its breath. My watch read 1:47 a.m. I lay perfectly still, and that's when I noticed it. Faint, pale yellow lights moving through the trees in the valley below. Lanterns? Torches? They bobbed between trunks, weaving like they knew exactly where they were going. I grabbed my binoculars, heart thudding, and pressed them to my face. 3 lights, more precisely 3 shapes of faint luminescence, moving parallel, gliding as if on rails through unmarked wilderness. No stumbling, no hesitation, no wandering. They moved as though they had been there 1,000 times before, a silent procession in the dark. I tried rational explanations. Local hunters, maybe a patrol checking traps. Nothing made sense. Normal hikers stumble. These lights didn't. Normal hikers stop to adjust their gear. These didn't. Around 2:15 a.m., they changed direction, simultaneously angling upward toward the ridge, toward me. I lowered the binoculars, chest tightening. Could be coincidence. The ridge is a natural path, but the timing, the precision, the gliding movement, it was deliberate. They were ascending toward my location. I stayed put. Hiking blindly in the dark seemed far more dangerous than standing still and observing. The lights disappeared from sight after about 40 minutes as they dropped below the tree line. Silence returned. I sat against a tree, knife in hand, headlamp off. The remains of my fire were cold, gray ash. I did not want to be seen, and in the dark, invisibility felt like protection. The mountains seemed older, hostile, aware. I do not know when I fell asleep. Exhaustion claimed me. When I woke, pale gray light filtered through the trees. Dawn. My neck ached from sleeping upright, fingers stiff from holding the knife. I exhaled a long, shaky breath. In daylight, everything appeared almost normal. The valley was just a valley, green and quiet. The ridge, just a ridge. Relief washed over me, but only for a moment. Near the cold ashes of my fire, I saw them. Footprints. Bare, wide, toes splayed unnaturally, pressed into the soft earth just 8 feet from where I had leaned. At least a dozen prints overlapped, forming a deliberate circle around the fire pit. Whoever had made them had stood right next to me while I slept. Traced the path with my eyes toward the eastern edge of the clearing into dense rhododendron. They had been there, silent, watching. I packed in under 5 minutes, leaving the fire, leaving the careful routines of camp behind. I moved away from the ridge, hiking north toward the main trail. Every few minutes I stopped, listening, scanning the trees. Silence. The forest felt too quiet, as though it were holding back something, waiting. I did not look back. 7 hours later, exhausted, dehydrated, I reached Bradshaw's Crossing, a speck of a town with a gas station, a general store, and a scattering of old houses along a 2-lane road. I must have been a wreck, dirty, wild-eyed. The elderly woman at the counter gave me a hard look, then said softly, almost casually, "Most folks around here know better than to camp up on Craven Ridge. Families in those hollows. They don't like strangers." She did not explain further. She just handed my change, eyes saying I was lucky to be alive. I left the next morning, selling my backpack and gear within the week. I have not returned to Appalachia since. I do not intend to. Sometimes in the quiet dark of my apartment, I hear it, the rhythm of falling stones, echoing off ridges, a warning or a message I was never meant to fully understand. Even now, I sometimes wonder about those lights, the footprints, and the sense that I was being observed. I survived that night, but the forest didn't let me leave unchanged. There is a part of me that will never feel safe under dense canopy, where shadows move and silence is too loud. The lesson is clear. The wilderness is beautiful, but it is also vast, ancient, and sometimes aware. Some nights, there are things that move without sound, watching, testing, waiting. And if you are not careful, it chooses to let you see enough to understand, but not enough to intervene. I survived. But part of me is still there, somewhere on Craven Ridge, counting rocks, watching. My college roommate, Harper, had been planning this camping trip for months. It was supposed to be a celebration. All 5 of us had just survived the chaos of our junior year finals, and we were desperate to decompress before summer internships scattered us across different states. The group was me, Harper, our friend Dakota from the photography club, and 2 guys from our study group, Mason and Ryder. Harper and I had shared a dorm since freshman year, which made me 21 that spring. Still young enough to believe that terrible things only happened to people who made foolish decisions. I had known Mason since orientation week. He had always been intense, but in a way that seemed harmless back then. He was the type who would text you a dozen times if you didn't reply within an hour, who remembered every tiny detail of every conversation. Harper used to joke that he would make someone a very attentive boyfriend someday. None of us were laughing by the end of that weekend. We drove up to Red Pine Ridge in Mason's pickup truck on a Friday afternoon. The campsite was about 4 hours from campus, deep in a national forest Harper had discovered on a hiking forum. She had printed maps, packed enough supplies for a week, even though we were only staying 2 nights, and created an entire itinerary of trails, lookout points, and hidden streams she wanted to explore. The drive up was easy enough. We blasted music, shared snacks, joked about professors, and teased each other about our summer plans. Mason, however, was quieter than usual, staring out the window at the passing pine trees, his jaw tight. I thought he was simply tired from finals, but there was a tension in his posture I hadn't noticed before. By the time we turned off the main road onto the narrow dirt path that led to the clearing Harper had chosen, the sun was dipping below the tree line. The forest closed around us like a tunnel, branches scraping against the truck, whispering against the metal. The isolation felt freeing, exhilarating even. But as soon as we stepped out of the truck, I sensed a subtle shift, like the woods themselves were watching. We set up camp in a clearing about half a mile from where we had parked. Ryder and Harper set up tents, while Dakota gathered kindling for the fire pit. Mason immediately started giving instructions, even though nobody asked him to. He straightened stakes, adjusted rain flies, sifted through Dakota's collected sticks, tossing aside any he deemed too damp or too thin. I watched from a distance, the tension in his movements making my stomach twist. When I asked if he was okay, he looked at me, blank. Not angry, not sad, just empty. Then he smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. Harper caught my gaze and mouthed, "Finals," as though that explained everything. I wanted to believe her. That first night around the campfire should have been magical. The sky was a glittering sea of stars, more than I had ever seen in the city. Dakota had brought her portable speaker so we could play music while roasting marshmallows. But Mason kept steering conversations into strange, uncomfortable territory. He reminded us of moments when he had helped us, driving Harper home after a party, editing Dakota's photography portfolio, lending Ryder money for books, giving me rides to the pharmacy during a winter flu. All technically true, but delivered in a way that made it seem like we owed him. Ryder, tried to change the subject, but Mason kept returning to his self-aggrandizing tales. By the time we crawled into our tents around midnight, the easy laughter from the drive had vanished, replaced by unease. I woke the next morning to the sound of arguing. Pale light filtered through the tent fabric, and Mason's voice, low and insistent, carried across the clearing. I peeked out to see him gesturing toward the trees, talking to Dakota, who had her arms crossed, face pale. When she tried to step away, he held her arm just a second too long before releasing her. She retreated silently back to her tent, and I pretended to sleep, my heart pounding. Later, Dakota admitted Mason had tried to convince her to take an early morning hike with him, just the two of them. When she refused, he became strange, not angry, not aggressive, just unnervingly insistent, as if her refusal was incomprehensible. Harper suggested we stick together for the rest of the trip, which we agreed to, but Mason acted like nothing had happened. Throughout the morning, Mason found subtle ways to separate us. He asked Ryder to help collect firewood farther into the forest, walking deeper until Ryder insisted they return. He lured Harper to a hidden viewpoint and pouted when she stayed with the group. He appeared silently beside me whenever I wandered alone, offering casual conversation, while his eyes tracked me with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. By noon, we all noticed the pattern. Ryder pulled me aside, whispering that Mason's behavior was seriously wrong. He had spent the morning lamenting that none of us appreciated him, that he did everything for the group and got nothing in return. Ryder's hands trembled as he admitted he wanted to leave immediately. We all did, but Mason had the only vehicle and the keys in his pocket. The tension was suffocating. Every word Mason said carried a hidden barb. Compliments were layered with condescension, friendly remarks with thinly veiled criticism. When Harper mentioned her summer internship, Mason remarked on her luck, while insinuating the rest of us had to struggle for everything. When Dakota photographed the creek, Mason asked if she ever tired of hiding behind a camera instead of connecting with real people. Each sentence made the air heavier. Around 4 p.m., Dakota announced she needed a nap. Harper followed. Ryder, suddenly claiming a headache, retreated to the tent he shared with Mason. I tried to follow Harper, desperate to regroup, but Mason stepped directly into my path. He said he needed to talk, alone. His voice was calm, gentle even. but something underneath made my instincts scream to run. He claimed he had found an injured hiker about a mile down the eastern trail, alone and in need of urgent help. He wanted us to go immediately, just the two of us. The insistence on just the two of us made my pulse race. I suggested we get Ryder. Mason's expression darkened momentarily before returning to calmness. He argued Ryder would slow us down, that the woman was suffering, that we were wasting time. For a fleeting moment, his tone seemed sincere, almost believable. Then I remembered the morning. Mason had been with Dakota at dawn, trying to convince her to hike with him. He could not have found anyone injured alone in the woods. The realization hit like ice water. There was no injured hiker. There never had been. I yanked my hand away, heart hammering, and claimed I needed to use the bathroom first. Mason's eyes bore into me until I was out of sight. Then I ran straight to Harper's tent. I threw the flap open, breath ragged, and whispered everything. The fake hiker, the earlier intensity, the lies. Harper pulled me inside, zipping it shut. We could hear Mason calling my name, calm and friendly through the thin fabric, the normalcy of his tone making it worse. Ryder emerged from his tent after hearing the commotion. Mason intercepted him, spinning a story that I had overreacted, that there was no reason to panic. The smooth rationality of his lies made my stomach churn, but Harper squeezed my hand, urging we act fast. Dakota scrambled with her phone, searching for a signal that didn't exist. Ryder confronted Mason. There was a scuffle, a thud, and Ryder shouted for us to run. Harper unzipped the back flap, and the three of us scrambled into the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces. Mason's voice followed, still calm, insisting we were overreacting. We ran blindly toward the dirt road, lungs burning, muscles screaming. Harper remembered a ranger station about 2 miles back. We sprinted, fueled by fear, and reached it as dusk fell. The ranger behind the desk immediately understood our panic and called for assistance. 2 rangers drove us back to the campsite. Mason sat calmly by the fire, marshmallow in hand, as if nothing had happened. Ryder bore a bruise under his eye. The rangers escorted us back to safety. Mason wasn't arrested, but the events were documented, a record left behind. We never spoke to him again. I later learned he transferred schools. Even now, I think about that moment in the clearing when he tried to lure me into the woods. I imagine what could have happened if I had not remembered that morning, if I had believed him. Some nights I still wake up imagining the calm voice behind the trees, insisting everything is normal, while shadows move silently around me. The forest is beautiful, but it is older, smarter, and darker than anyone realizes. And sometimes, you survive encounters not because you are lucky, but because you remember just enough to resist. Camping alone seemed like a good idea when I booked the trip back in late February. My cousins were all busy with weddings, baby showers, or new jobs. Everyone else had their lives neatly tied up in routines and responsibilities, while I was still stuck in the same apartment I'd rented since college. The monotony of my 9-to-5 at a distribution center in Kansas City had started feeling suffocating. I needed something raw, something that reminded me I was still alive, and maybe even capable of surviving on my own. I decided on a remote part of the Ozark National Forest, about 4 hours southeast of my apartment. The place was deep enough into the woods that my phone service vanished almost immediately after I passed the last small town. There were no maintained campsites, no rangers on patrol, just me, the forest, and whatever else lived out there. I had scouted maps online, pored over topographic satellite images, and even watched a couple of survival vlogs of people exploring the area. I wanted solitude, but I also wanted a challenge. I had no idea what I was about to walk into. I arrived around 2 p.m. on a crisp Friday in early March. The forest smelled of damp earth, pine sap, and the faint tang of a nearby creek. The canopy was thick, but enough sunlight filtered through to make the fallen leaves glow gold and copper. I parked on what looked like an old logging access road, partially overgrown, and hiked about 50 yards into the trees to set up camp. My site was perfect, or at least it seemed that way. I pitched my tent near a large, fallen oak that had snapped years ago, leaving a hollow under its roots that looked like it could shelter a human if necessary. The first day passed almost peacefully. I spent the afternoon hiking a trail that curved along a shallow ridge. The leaves crunched under my boots, the air smelled sharp and clean, and the occasional deer would pause to watch me, eyes glinting in the filtered sunlight, before vanishing into the underbrush. By the time the sun dipped behind the hills, I had a small fire going, and I cooked my usual camping fare: canned chili, bread, and a thermos of coffee. Sitting there, flames flickering, I felt that rare sense of solitude that city life rarely afforded me. Owls hooted in the distance, and the trees swayed like they were whispering secrets I could almost understand. By 9 p.m., I was inside my tent with a paperback I had been meaning to read for months. The forest had settled into the kind of stillness that makes you hyper-aware of every sound: branches creaking, leaves rustling, the occasional rodent scuttling across the forest floor. I fell asleep around 10:30, feeling more peaceful than I had in years, completely unaware that my peace was about to be ripped apart. I woke around 3:12 a.m. At first I thought it was a dream, a low metallic rumble, almost like an engine straining against uneven terrain. Out here, you get used to natural sounds: twigs snapping, wind brushing the canopy, animals shifting in the underbrush. This was none of that. The rumble grew louder, multiple engines now, moving deliberately along the old logging road. I froze in my sleeping bag, heart hammering, telling myself, maybe it was just hunters. But something about the precision of the movement made every instinct scream at me to stay still. I peeked through the mesh of my tent. There they were, 2 blacked-out pickup trucks, tires crunching on the overgrown dirt, and at least 5 men unloading rectangular bundles wrapped in black plastic. I counted them as they moved in a precise chain: 1, 2, 3, 12. Their voices were low, urgent whispers. Fragments reached me. "Count's off." Rye screwed it up. "Hurry up." These weren't hunters or casual campers. These were professionals, and they weren't looking for game. A tall man with broad shoulders and a baseball cap stepped away, pulling a flashlight from his belt. The beam swept the road slowly, deliberately, and for a horrifying second, it passed within 10 feet of my tent. I pressed my face against the dirt and pulled my legs closer, heart pounding in my ears. A smaller man produced a handgun, another a shotgun, both held casually but ready. They were searching. And then I realized my footprints, the ones I had left during my hike, faint but visible in the dirt and leaf litter. The tall man's flashlight stopped directly over them. 3 others joined him, checking each print with painstaking attention. I could feel the panic rise, curling in my chest like ice. The bullets weren't going to matter if they found me now. They would handle me quietly and efficiently. Survival meant staying invisible. I had maybe 2 minutes. Crawling out of the tent was risky, but staying inside was suicidal. My eyes darted to the fallen oak I'd noticed earlier. Its roots had lifted the earth, forming a hollow just wide enough for me to wedge inside. My phone, knife, and backpack were all I could grab. I unzipped the tent slowly, body pressed flat, and slipped out, belly against the cold earth, crawling toward salvation. Every rustle of leaves beneath me sounded like a gunshot. I shoved myself into the root hollow, dragging leaves over my legs and pressing my face into the dirt. The smell of rot and dampness filled my nostrils. I held my breath as flashlights swept the forest, stopping briefly near the hollow. I could hear one of the men muttering in frustration, pacing, boots caked in mud. For the next hour, they moved through the trees around my hiding spot. Each passing beam felt like a test of my very existence. At one point, a pair of boots stopped less than 5 feet from my hiding place. I could see the mud-slicked leather through a gap in the roots. The man's flashlight hovered directly above me, lingering, searching. I prayed. I whispered to myself, promising that if I survived, I would never again complain about mundane life, that the monotony of my days, the endless repetition, would suddenly feel like a gift compared to this nightmare. Eventually, the men returned to their trucks. Engines roared to life, tires crunching over the eroded road. The dark pickups disappeared into the distance, leaving behind nothing but disturbed leaves and the sound of my ragged breathing. I did not move. I stayed in the hollow until the first gray light of dawn filtered through the trees. Only then did I crawl out, coated in dirt, leaves, and some sticky substance I didn't dare identify. The tent had been destroyed. My backpack was tossed, gear scattered. But I was alive and unseen. I gathered what I could salvage and hiked as quickly as possible back to my car. It took nearly 3 hours to reach the main road, another 40 minutes before my phone finally picked up a signal. I stopped at a gas station, called the local sheriff's office, and gave my statement. Deputy Torres, mid-50s, with the kind of tired voice that tells you she's seen more horrors than you could imagine, assured me the report would be passed to the sheriff and even the DEA. She suggested staying with family for a while. I didn't need her to explain further. Nothing ever came of it officially. No arrests, no news stories, no matching drug or smuggling operations in the Ozarks during that time. Once or twice, I wondered if they ever figured out who I was, if they came back to check the campsite, if they found the remnants I had left behind. Sometimes, late at night, I still imagine headlights in the distance and my stomach knots, pulling me back into that hollow, face pressed into the dirt, praying the boots don't come closer. I still go camping now, but never alone, never deep in the woods. I stick to established sites with rangers, families, and cell coverage. I traded solitude for safety, and I've made my peace with that. But the memory of those black pickups, the silent bundles, and the boots caked in mud will never leave me. Most of my coworkers had told me I was crazy. Solo backpacking in the Cascades, they said, was reckless, especially for a woman traveling alone. They never missed a chance to remind me of the news stories: hikers disappearing, women vanishing on trails, the occasional abandoned tent left behind with nothing but disturbed earth around it. By the spring of 2014, I had stopped listening. My marriage had ended 6 months prior, a slow unraveling of promises and dreams. Friends from nursing school were wrapped up in toddlers, soccer practice, PTA meetings, lives that felt impossibly distant from my own. Somewhere around my 34th birthday, I realized that the loneliness I felt in crowded rooms was worse than any solitude the wilderness could offer. Oregon called to me. The Cascade Range, specifically, where Douglas firs grew thick and tall enough to blot out the sky, where silence became so complete that you could hear your own heartbeat echo between the trees. It became my refuge. I had planned this particular trek for weeks, a 4-day solo venture into a section of the backcountry that few day hikers ever reached. The map marked barely more than faint dotted lines for old logging roads, and the rest was uncharted territory, dense forest and sheer cliffs. My younger sister, Verity, called the night before I left. Her voice was tight with worry as she rattled off news stories she'd found. Women missing on trails, abandoned campsites, strange noises in the woods. I promised her I would check in at every trailhead, that I had my satellite beacon, and that I knew the risks. She wasn't convinced, but she let me go anyway. The first 2 days unfolded almost meditative. My boots found rhythm on packed earth, crossing streams so clear I could count every pebble on the bottom. My body ached in ways that felt purposeful, earned, the kind of fatigue that made me feel alive instead of empty. I covered 14 miles each day, stopping only to filter water or take a brief rest in a sunbeam that managed to pierce the dense canopy. By the third evening, I had pushed deep into the backcountry. Roughly 7 miles from the nearest trailhead, I stumbled upon a clearing that felt almost deliberately hidden. It was the kind of place hikers whispered about, but never shared coordinates for. A small patch of level ground, a clear-running creek maybe 30 feet away, encircled by towering firs that formed a natural fortress. I set up camp as golden light filtered through the canopy. My food hung from a high branch, far from the reach of raccoons or black bears. By nightfall, I crawled into my sleeping bag, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that only comes from walking miles on uneven mountain terrain. I remember zipping my tent closed, thinking finally, I could breathe. Sleep did not come quietly. I woke to the faintest sound of the tent zipper moving, not quickly, not the careless tug of wind against nylon, but slow, deliberate, one tooth at a time, a soft purr that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet of the forest. My eyes snapped open, every muscle locked. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was hearing. It could be a raccoon, I told myself. Maybe the fabric had shifted in the cooling night air. But I had camped dozens of times and knew the difference between wind and deliberate human interference. This was deliberate. Someone was outside, testing, waiting, watching. Time slowed. Seconds stretched into eternities as I lay frozen, adrenaline flooding my system. I thought of the pepper spray clipped to my belt, the small knife I carried, the satellite beacon meant to summon help, but all of it meant nothing if I was caught off guard. The zipper stopped. I forced myself to sit up. My sleeping bag rustled too loudly, like a betraying drum in the stillness. I fumbled for my headlamp, thumb hovering over the power button like it was a trigger. I counted slowly to 30, silently giving whoever, or whatever, was outside a chance to leave. Then I pulled the zipper in one motion and aimed the headlamp into the night. Nothing. Trees loomed pale and ghostly in the beam, shadows stretching long across the forest floor. The clearing was empty. Only the creek murmured in the distance, indifferent. I nearly laughed, telling myself it was stress, exhaustion, imagination. But then my eyes caught something I hadn't noticed before. My hiking poles. I always planted them in an X beside my tent vestibule before bed. Now they lay flat on the ground, parallel, nearly perfectly aligned, 3 feet from where I had left them. I shone the light across my campsite. My pack leaned against a tree, the main compartment unfastened, the contents shifted. My first aid kit sat on top of my rain jacket, not beneath it like I had packed. Someone had been in my camp while I slept, quietly enough that I only awoke to the tentative testing of my zipper. I froze. The realization struck like a blow. Someone had moved through my campsite deliberately. They had tracked me here, through unmarked trails, found this secluded clearing, circled my tent, inspected the space I had occupied inches from them, and left almost nothing but subtle evidence. Then I saw the boot prints. Clear and deep in the soft earth, oversized men's hiking boots, size 11 or 12, thick tread, made 2 complete circles around my tent. The first circle traced the vestibule. The second passed directly behind where my head had rested. The last impression showed a man standing perfectly still, silent, inches from my skull, observing me through the thin layer of nylon. The line of footprints led back into the forest, fading into nothing. Every survival instinct screamed at me to run. Grab the beacon, hit SOS, start moving. But in the dark, 7 miles from the trailhead, running could be worse. Twisted ankles, lost footing, running straight into whoever had stalked me. I forced myself to think. I shoved the pepper spray into my waistband, gripped my knife in my right hand, and stuffed everything I could carry. Pack, poles, rocks, inside the tent. I zipped myself in again, back against my gear. Headlamp pointed at the entrance, willing the night to remain silent. Hours passed. Every sound of the forest, the creek's trickle, an owl's wings, a falling branch, felt like a threat. The sun crept slowly upward, painting pale gray light across the canopy. Only then did I allow myself a long exhale. No one had returned, no second attempt at entry. But I knew I was not safe. I packed frantically. Photos of the boot prints my only proof. 2 full loops, deep impressions, a single line leading into nothing. Every snap of a branch underfoot, every shadow, felt like the predatory gaze of whoever had circled my tent. I reached the trailhead in record time. What should have taken 4 hours took just under 3. My legs burned, lungs screamed, but I refused to stop for more than a moment. At the parking lot, I froze. My car sat untouched, but 2 other vehicles were there, a green pickup with Montana plates and a white sedan with a bike rack. Was one of them connected? Were they waiting, or already gone? I drove to the ranger station 20 miles down the mountain. Ranger Colleen, mid-50s with gray streaks in her braid, and the calm demeanor only decades in the field can bring, listened carefully to my story. She viewed the photos and frowned. Serious. "You're not the first," she said quietly. That summer alone, 2 other reports had come in from solo female hikers. The descriptions mirrored mine. Nighttime intrusion, careful zipper testing, objects moved or rearranged. One woman woke to find her boots neatly placed outside her tent. Another found a small pile of stones beside her head. "They increase patrols," she said, "but they never catch them. No permanent camp. No evidence. Whoever it is, they're meticulous, patient, and experienced." I drove home, shaken, and avoided the Cascades for 2 years. I still hike, but never alone, never camp in isolation. The mountains, once my refuge, now carry a memory of silent footsteps, patient and calculated, moving unseen through the trees. At night, I lie awake in my apartment, listening to the city hum beyond the locked doors. I think of those boot prints circling my tent, the precision, the patience, the quiet terror. Somewhere in those mountains, someone is still out there, walking through the trees, circling tents, waiting for the next hiker who doesn't wake up. I remember the morning like it was yesterday. It was early June, and my friend Mason had just turned 27. Instead of the usual bar night we'd all grown tired of, Mason suggested something different, something that sounded adventurous and a little reckless. A camping trip to Pine Ridge Lake, tucked away in the hills of northern Ohio. The lake was part of a sprawling state park, that few people ventured to, and Mason promised solitude, quiet fishing spots, and a break from the grind of city life. Along with Mason and his girlfriend Rachel, there was Tyler, his younger brother Owen, and me. We were all friends since high school, with Owen a couple years behind us. The idea of a weekend back in nature was thrilling. We packed our gear early Friday morning, the sun just peeking over the horizon. Cooler filled with beer, tents folded tight, fishing rods clinking together. Everything felt perfect. The drive north was scenic, rolling green hills dotted with wildflowers and streams. Pine Ridge Lake looked untouched from the map, a little gem hidden between hills and thick woodlands. Arriving at the campground around 4 p.m., we were greeted by the park ranger, a tall man in his late 60s, with a sun-weathered face. He handed us a campground map and pointed to Site 22 at the far end of the loop. "Weekdays are slow this time of year," he said. "You might have the whole section to yourself." Mason's eyes lit up. He loved the idea of absolute privacy. Setting up camp was quick, but fun. Mason and Tyler carried the heavy tent, while Rachel meticulously arranged sleeping bags and pillows. I handled the firewood and coolers, grateful for the early summer warmth. Rachel even brought a homemade chocolate cake for Mason, and we placed candles on it as the sun began to dip behind the tree line. The sky turned an almost unnatural orange, reflecting perfectly on the still lake water. That first night felt magical. As darkness descended, we gathered around the fire. Tyler's portable speaker played classic rock softly in the background. We laughed, toasted, told old stories, and roasted marshmallows. Hours slipped by without a care, until Tyler said he needed something from the car. When he returned, his face had a strange tension. "I thought I saw a light," he said, voice low, "like a flashlight moving near Site 21, low to the ground." We all turned, trying to see through the blackness. Nothing. Mason shrugged, saying it was probably the ranger checking the area. Rachel joked about deer eyes reflecting light. But Tyler's unease was palpable. Every few minutes, he glanced toward the trees nervously. I felt the forest tighten around us, the spaces between the trees seeming darker and deeper than they had hours ago. Around midnight, laughter erupted. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. Several voices, jovial, cutting through the quiet night. Rachel shrugged it off, suggesting late arrivals from other sites, but none of us had heard any cars or tents being set up. And then it stopped, leaving only a silence that made the hair on my neck stand straight. We tried to laugh it off, poured another round of whiskey, and carried on. But the energy had shifted. Every shadow in the firelight seemed to move on its own. Every rustle in the leaves made us freeze. Rachel and Mason retired to their tent first, Tyler and Owen to their smaller tent, and I stayed behind to ensure the fire was completely out. That's when I saw it. A flashlight beam sweeping slowly from the woods about 60 yards away. It stopped, focused, and I felt it like a weight pressing down on me. Then it clicked off. I didn't tell anyone. Part of me hoped I was imagining it. Crawling into my own small tent, I lay fully clothed on my sleeping bag, staring at the nylon ceiling, listening to the forest. Nothing. Not a sound. Not a breeze. Nothing but my racing heartbeat. I must have dozed off because I awoke to urgent whispers outside my tent. Tyler and Owen were talking in hushed voices. Checking my phone, I saw it was nearly 3 a.m. Carefully, I unzipped my tent and stepped out. And there it was. At the edge of Site 21, maybe 40 feet away. A human figure standing perfectly still, staring at us. No flashlight, no motion, just stillness. We froze, my throat dry, hands shaking. Owen wanted to wake Rachel and Mason, but Tyler insisted we stay quiet. Then, footsteps in the trees behind us, moving with our pace along the edge of the forest. And that laughter again. Low, deliberate, as if someone was playing a game just for them, just for us. We grabbed whatever we could, flashlights, a hatchet, and rocks, and ran toward the parking lot, adrenaline pushing us faster than we thought possible. Every shadow looked alive, every tree a potential hiding place. When we reached the lot, our vehicle, the only one there since we'd all driven together, was a wreck. Tires slashed, rims buried in rubber ribbons. Whoever it was had taken their time, been methodical. Phones revealed no signal. 3 hours from home, stranded. Tyler suggested walking to the ranger station, about a mile away. Rachel refused to move, terrified. That's when the sound came again. The unmistakable ripping of a tent zipper from our campsite. Someone rifling through everything we'd left behind. A cooler lid slammed, a heavy object dragged. The laughter boomed, echoing across the clearing. There was one thing we knew. This wasn't random. Whoever this was knew the terrain, had been watching us all night, and had trapped us. Mason made the call. We were going, together, to the ranger station. Hatchet in hand, rocks ready, we moved down the narrow road cutting through thick woods, every shadow a potential threat. Footsteps followed us in the trees, matching our speed. Then closer. Branches snapping, leaves rustling. That laugh just faint enough to make our hearts pound. The emergency phone outside the station was a blur. Mason smashed the glass, dialing 911. Sheriff vehicles arrived 40 minutes later, lights cutting through the morning mist. They found our campsite destroyed, tents shredded, supplies scattered, footprints leading into the dense forest, boot prints that matched no one we knew. A deputy explained similar reports in the past. A drifter, living rough in these woods, always vanishing before authorities could reach him. We gave our statements. A tow truck arrived for our vehicle, and Mason's father drove down for a pickup. Silence dominated the ride home. Rachel and Mason eventually broke up. Tyler refuses to go camping again. And me? I still think about the man in the shadows. I still wonder what might have happened if we hadn't run when we did, if we hadn't seen the tires, the zipper, the tracks. And I remember that laugh, deliberate and chilling, echoing in the trees of Pine Ridge Lake. Even now, months later, I can't shake it. Somewhere out there in the northern Ohio hills, he's still walking the forest, patient, waiting, laughing. I had been counting down the days to that camping weekend for weeks. Life had been relentlessly loud lately. Emails and notifications constantly buzzing, people demanding attention, and deadlines suffocating me. I needed somewhere that felt like it existed outside of the world, a place where my phone couldn't scream at me every few minutes. It was early June, and my friend Harper had suggested a short getaway to Echo Lake, a quiet state park a few hours northeast of Cleveland. According to him, the place was barely on any maps, tucked into dense pines, with a lake so still it seemed like it was holding its breath. I jumped at the idea. The group that weekend was small but close. Harper, his cousin Rowan, our mutual friend Cassidy, and me. 4 of us crammed into Harper's aging SUV, loaded to the brim with tents, coolers, and a chaotic assortment of snacks and drinks. The playlist we'd made for the drive barely held together, shuffling from folk to classic rock. But it didn't matter. We were on our way, leaving the city behind. Arriving at the campsite late in the afternoon, I immediately noticed how quiet it was. Pine needles carpeted the ground, the lake reflecting the sun in a mirror of orange and gold. The loop of the campground had maybe a dozen sites, but ours, number 14, was at the far end, nestled against a ridge where the forest thickened. Setting up camp was strangely therapeutic. Stakes hammered into the soft earth, logs dragged into a circle around the fire pit, arguments over who tied knots the worst. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. As dusk fell, the bluish twilight hour settled in. The trees became silhouettes, and our conversations loosened with the fading sun. Harper fired up an old portable grill that looked like it belonged in a museum, and we cooked dinner, laughing as food flopped onto plates. Cassidy produced a bag of marshmallows, and soon we were telling stories that grew more absurd with each drink. The fire crackled and spat embers into the sky, making the surrounding woods feel distant, like we were in a bubble of warmth and sound. At some point, Rowan taught us a ridiculous hand-motion song she remembered from summer camp, and after a couple beers, none of us could keep up. We were loud, carefree, and completely comfortable. Everything felt uncomplicated. Perfect, even. It must have been close to midnight when Cassidy froze mid-sentence, head tilted toward the ridge above our sight. Through the gaps in the tall pines, we noticed a pickup truck parked on the narrow dirt road that ran along the hill. No lights, no engine noise, nothing. But it was there, almost impossibly still. Harper muttered that it might be someone taking a break, maybe lost on their way somewhere. Cassidy joked it was probably a guy looking for a bathroom in the woods. None of us wanted to admit how tense we were. Eventually, the truck moved, rolling slowly along the gravel, and the moment passed. We told ourselves it wasn't anything, and when the fire burned low, we crawled into our tents. Harper and Rowan shared one tent. Cassidy and I took the smaller one nearby. Conversation thinned, and sleep eventually claimed us. I woke sometime in the dead of night to the sound of footsteps. Measured, deliberate steps, soft enough not to be clumsy, heavy enough to compress the soil underfoot. They moved between the tents, pausing near the fire pit. I held my breath, heart hammering, straining to hear beyond the rustle of pine needles and the occasional creak of branches. There was a faint metallic clink, and then silence again. Harper whispered something, but I couldn't make it out. For what felt like forever, we lay there, frozen, until finally, the night returned to an uneasy calm. Morning arrived in a pale, hesitant light. One by one, we emerged from the tents, pretending we'd slept well, though our eyes betrayed us. Rowan admitted she'd heard someone brushing past her tent before dawn. Cassidy said she thought she heard quiet breathing outside her door, but dismissed it as the wind. None of us mentioned the truck. It was better left unsaid. Yet the image of its dark, still shape on the ridge lingered, gnawing at the edges of our minds. We gathered around the remains of the fire, trying to act normal, sipping lukewarm coffee and munching granola bars. That's when Harper called us over to the cooler. The lid was open, and most of our food was gone. Not scattered by animals, not torn apart, but gone, neatly removed. Some bars were stacked aside, as if whoever had come knew exactly what they were doing. The campsite bore no signs of wildlife, no claw marks, no animal tracks. Just a set of boot prints around the fire, deep and crisp, clearly left only hours before the sun rose. We loaded everything into the SUV, the keys carefully placed in a small bag. No one spoke during the drive back, each of us replaying the night over and over. Harper kept glancing in the rearview mirror, and my pulse jumped each time he did. The sense of someone lingering, watching, studying our every move stayed with us. We stopped at the ranger station on the way back, leaving the keys with the officer on duty. He asked if we'd found them near the old logging trails. We hadn't mentioned the trails. When we told him our campsite number, he let out a slow breath and said they'd had scattered reports over the years, of a man in an older pickup observing campsites from the back roads. Never violent, just peculiar behavior. Early morning tire tracks, small missing items, rearranged belongings, little acts meant to unnerve. No one had ever caught him, and no description had ever been clear enough to help. That was the final push. We returned home, never camping in that park again. I still think about those footsteps in the dark, the silent circles around the tents, the stillness that felt alive, and the way the forest seemed to hold its breath. I am grateful every day that we left before anyone fully woke up, because I know, somewhere out there near Echo Lake, the Watcher is still moving quietly among the trees, patient, silent, observing. I had been craving a break from everything. Emails, calls, constant notifications, the chaos of the city. When my older cousin, Garrett, suggested a weekend camping trip to Pine Hollow State Park in northern Michigan, I jumped at it. Garrett had always been a wilderness enthusiast, and the idea of a quiet lake surrounded by pines sounded perfect. Joining us was my childhood friend Rowan and his younger brother, Milo. 3 of us piled into Garrett's beat-up SUV with way too much gear: tents, sleeping bags, a cooler packed with snacks, and a small portable grill that looked like it belonged in a museum. The drive through the winding back roads was calm, the sun dipping low behind the trees. Even the playlist Garrett made, a mixture of folk and classic rock, didn't feel like background noise. It felt like it belonged to the moment. By late afternoon, we arrived at our campsite, tucked at the far end of the park. Pine needles carpeted the ground like a soft, fragrant rug, and the lake sat so still it was hard to tell where the water ended and the sky began. The campsite was isolated, far enough from others that we didn't see a single soul the entire time we set up. We pitched the tents, gathered logs around the fire pit, and argued over who could tie knots the worst. By the time everything was in order, it felt like the forest itself had slowed down time just for us. As evening fell, the fire crackled. The breeze carried the faint scent of pine and lake water, and our conversations drifted naturally, from the stress of school and work to memories of past summer trips. Garrett lit the old grill, and Milo pulled out a bag of marshmallows. Soon, we were roasting them, telling stories that got dumber and louder with each marshmallow burned. The fire's warmth felt like a bubble, isolating us from the world, making the distant forest seem softer, less threatening. I remember the moment clearly. It was just past midnight, the forest wrapped in a shadowy stillness, when Milo froze mid-laugh and tilted his head toward the tree line above our campsite. There, partially obscured by the tall pines, was a dirt road running along the ridge. At first it looked empty, but then a dark shape appeared. A pickup truck, parked and completely still. No lights, no movement, just the faint growl of an idling engine. We tried to laugh it off. Garrett suggested maybe it was someone taking a break. Milo joked it might be a lost camper looking for a bathroom, but the longer we stared, the less convincing our explanations sounded. Eventually, the truck rolled away slowly, and we returned to our tents, convincing ourselves it had been nothing. I shared a tent with Rowan. We lay there, talking quietly, until sleep began to pull us under. I remember waking deep into the night, unable to tell why at first. There was no cold, no obvious noise, just the usual nighttime sounds of the forest, branches shifting, insects humming. Rowan was asleep, curled inside his sleeping bag. Then I heard it. A faint whisper, soft and deliberate, threading through the tent fabric. It wasn't wind. It wasn't some animal brushing against the canvas. It was a voice. Low, careful, deliberate. And it said my name. Not shouted. Not normal. More like someone deliberately trying not to wake the rest of the world. I froze. My heart hammered. Then it said Rowan's name in the same drawn-out, breathy tone. He stirred slightly in his sleep but didn't wake. I pressed closer to the tent wall, trying to see a shadow through the fabric. Nothing. No movement, no footsteps, just the whisper echoing between the trees, repeating our names like whoever it was had known us all along. I tried to convince myself it was someone playing a prank, a nearby camper who had overheard us earlier. But the campsite was isolated, miles away from the nearest other site, and in the morning we found nothing. Not a single sign of another human. Picnic tables untouched, grills cold, fire rings undisturbed. We went to the small ranger station near the park entrance. The ranger looked at us with a calm, almost expectant expression. When I mentioned the voice, his tone shifted slightly. "Visitors sometimes report voices in the forest," he said quietly, calling their names. "Usually it happens just before someone disappears along the trails." I tried to laugh it off, though the words stuck like damp wood in my chest. Rowan kept glancing toward the tree line, and every shadow felt heavier than it should. We decided to take a short hike anyway, trying to distract ourselves, to shake off the creeping unease. The trail we picked was unnaturally quiet. Birds were silent, leaves overhead still. Milo pointed out oddly bent trees and broken branches, trying to keep things light. But I could feel tension crawling through the forest, thick and patient. At a fork in the trail, we hesitated. A wooden sign pointed left, toward a viewpoint. Rowan wanted to go that way, but Milo paused, staring at the right path. He whispered that he thought he heard the voice again, further down, threading through the undergrowth. It was distant, but unmistakable. Low, careful, dragging the syllables. We froze, listening. Silence. I told myself it was nerves, exaggeration, the lingering shadow of the ranger's warning. But as we approached the overlook, the forest felt different. Not darker, but heavier, as if it had been holding its breath for centuries. Rowan slowed beside me, her hair standing on end, her eyes wide. Then it came again. My name. Her name, drawn out and careful, like the forest itself was speaking. We stepped backward slowly at first, then faster until we reached the fork again. Whatever it was, it knew us. It was patient, deliberate, and entirely unseen. Back at the campsite, we didn't even sit. We threw our gear into Garrett's SUV with a coordinated urgency born of shared panic. The forest behind us looked normal in the daylight, but it felt heavy, ominous, a thin veneer hiding something beneath. Milo kept glancing at the narrow path leading to the lake, expecting someone, or something, to emerge. Driving back, silence reigned. No music, no conversation. Rowan's phone kept lighting up in her lap, showing blurry, indistinct images that seemed to be snapshots of the trail, even though she hadn't touched the camera. We didn't dare look closely. We just drove. At the ranger station again, the same man stepped out as if expecting us. I told him we had to leave. We didn't feel safe. He nodded, his face serious. "People who hear their names in these woods," he said softly, "always describe the same thing. A voice close, but hidden. Sometimes it sounds like family, sometimes like a friend. Every missing person case in the park started with that detail." We drove straight home, barely speaking. Neither of us slept for the next few nights. And even weeks later, every patch of woods we passed made me tense. Every whisper of the wind reminded me of Pine Hollow. Nothing ever called our names again, but the memory of that voice, patient and deliberate, has never faded. I still wonder what would have happened if we had followed it deeper into the forest. I'm just grateful we left when we did. Mornings at Pine Ridge Campground felt like stepping out of my everyday life and into a quieter, slower world. I'd come out here with my dog, Atlas, hoping a few days in the woods would give me the kind of peace I couldn't find back home. I was 16, stubborn, and convinced that silence was the only cure for the constant noise of school, homework, and family expectations. Atlas was unforgettable. A scruffy red and white mutt with one amber eye and one deep brown. He had this strange habit of tilting his head as if he understood every word I said. People used to laugh at how expressive he was, but out here in the deep forest, his attentiveness felt almost necessary. He was my companion and my anchor. We had been to this trail before, but that day felt different. The air carried weight, an almost tangible tension that I couldn't shake. The campground was mostly empty, except for a single family tucked away near the far stream. I wandered along the familiar paths, letting Atlas dart ahead, sniffing and circling, while I tried to imagine I had the entire forest to myself. By late afternoon, the light softened, casting long, golden streaks through the pines. The forest seemed older somehow, as though it had been watching for decades. Atlas paused repeatedly, ears pinned forward, his tail low, sniffing the air toward the dark slope behind our tent. Normally fearless, he now circled close to me, hesitant. I tossed him a treat, jokingly calling him a scaredy dog, but the unease in his eyes was unmistakable. The campsite itself was unusual. Pines on 3 sides and a steep slope behind us that disappeared into a shadowy ravine. Every time the wind blew through that section, the branches scraped against each other in a way that sounded almost deliberate, like cloth brushing over bark. I kept pretending not to notice, but every so often I found myself staring back at it, heart a little tighter each time. Dinner over the fire brought no relief. Atlas stiffened, tail low, nose twitching toward the slope. Then, softly, he whined, a low, uneasy sound I'd only heard once before, the night he'd cut his paw on broken glass and tried to hide it. Before I could call out, he trotted between the trees, glancing back as though expecting me to follow. I shouted after him, but he vanished into the thick underbrush, swallowed instantly by the layers of pine needles. Seconds turned into minutes. Then the forest fell silent in a way that felt unnatural. I called his name, louder this time, and the answer I got made my stomach knot. It was a whine, Atlas's, but wrong. Too clean, too precise, lacking the tremble that always ended his calls. Whoever or whatever had answered didn't know how a real dog sounded. I froze. My mind ran through every possibility, none of them comforting. I waved my flashlight toward the slope. Uneven branches and disturbed patches of underbrush caught the beam, evidence someone, or something, had been there recently. But there was no movement. The forest was eerily still, no birds, no insects, no distant rustle of animals, just the quiet, and the faint echo of that imitation whine that still lingered in my ears. I forced myself to return to the campsite, keeping the lantern high, scanning everything. The tent, the cooler, the scattered gear, untouched. But the atmosphere had shifted. The campsite no longer felt mine. Shadows stretched unnaturally, thin and crooked, creeping toward the tent, mismatched to the trees behind them. I checked my phone. No signal. Isolation hit me harder than I expected. I gripped Atlas's empty leash and realized I didn't even know which direction to search without risking getting lost. Every few minutes, subtle sounds teased me. A faint crack of a branch, the soft shift of leaves from the slope. It felt deliberate, like someone was mirroring my movements at a distance, only stepping when I stepped, pausing when I paused. The imitation whine returned, quieter this time, slower, deliberate, as if whoever made it was guiding me, luring me toward the shadows instead of calling directly. I stood still, heart racing, lantern shaking in my grip. Whoever had been out there had been practicing, waiting for the right moment. Exhaustion eventually won, and I sat against a tree, eyes heavy, trying to stay alert. The lantern's weak glow washed the area in pale, washed-out light. Every so often, I whispered Atlas's name softly, careful not to reveal my exact position, listening to the thick silence respond. The trees themselves seemed to hold their breath. Then I noticed movement near the slope, not a full figure, just a shift in the dark, retreating when the light caught it. That was all it took to convince me I wasn't imagining things. Someone had been watching the campsite long before Atlas wandered off. Hours crawled by. Every noise from the previous day replayed in my mind. Atlas sniffing the underbrush, branches scraping, the wrong whine echoing through the trees. Around dawn, a distant engine hummed to life near the trailhead. Old, rattling, deliberate, as if timed to the first touch of sunlight through the canopy. No voices, no doors slamming, no footsteps, just the engine fading down the dirt road. I stayed frozen, listening until it was gone. When sunlight finally reached the campsite, I grabbed my pack, calling Atlas in short bursts. My voice bounced oddly between the trees. A few yards ahead, I spotted him, lying partially hidden in a bed of ferns. His fur was ruffled, a shallow cut on his shoulder. His tail thumped weakly against the ground. Relief hit me like a tidal wave. I scooped him up, checking him carefully. Nothing deep, but his wide eyes never left the tree line. We headed back toward the trailhead together, and that's when I saw them. Tire tracks. Narrow, uneven, unmistakable. Fresh, not belonging to any ranger vehicle. Leading away from the campsite, in the direction the engine had gone. I didn't linger. Atlas secured, I drove straight home. The thought that someone had been watching, imitating Atlas, planning to separate us, never left me. The tiny flaw in the whine, the imperfection in the sound, was the only thing that stopped me from stepping into the forest that night. Weeks later, I still feel a pull when passing wooded areas. The memory of that imitation whine, the unnatural silence, the shadows stretching across the campsite. It never fades, and I can't shake the certainty that the woods knew my name.